This is Blue Left, a podcast dedicated to amplifying the underrepresented Democratic voices in Tennessee, working tirelessly to bring progressive change to the volunteer state. Here's your host, Peggy Kingsbury.
That's right. From grassroots organizers to community leaders, from urban centers to rural towns, we'll highlight the diverse perspectives and powerful voices that often go unheard. Join us as we lift up the blue wave and shine a light on the path toward a more inclusive and equitable Tennessee. Again, I'm your host, Peggy Kingsbury, and this is Blue Lift, where every voice matters. Let's get started. Well, hello, friends. I hope everyone is having a good week. You'll probably be listening to this episode fairly soon, so those of us in Middle Tennessee know that a winter showed up overnight. It's first real cool day we've had. I'm so excited today. My guest is Dr. Laura Seay. And you'll see in the show notes, her last name is spelled S-E-A-Y, and it's pronounced Seay. Dr. Seay is a consultant and research associate at the African Center for the Study of the United States at the University of Pretoria, South Africa. Laura grew up in Franklin, and she is a proud product of Franklin Special School District and Williamson County Schools. Laura earned her PhD in government from the University of Texas at Austin, and her research examines state capacity, conflict, and development in Africa's fragile states. She's been a college professor for 14 years, and her commentary has appeared in some really important places like the New York Times, the Washington Post, Slate, The Atlantic, and PBS NewsHour, among others. So, wow. Laura's got a lot going on. Now, I'm sure a lot of you are wondering, what in the world does the African Center for the Study of the United States at the University of Pretoria have to do with Blue Lift and politics and Tennessee? So let's just start, Laura. Tell us what the African Center for the Study of U.S. at the University of Pretoria, South Africa is.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me.
Sure.
I'm really thrilled to be here. And it's always great to get to talk to folks in Franklin, where I grew up. And had so many of my formative experiences. The University of Pretoria, of course, is a major research university in South Africa. So South Africa has 3 capitals. It's an unusual country, but Pretoria is the administrative capital. Where a lot of government agencies are located and do their thing. And historically in the United States, my master's degree is in African studies. The United States funded area study centers so that American citizens and others could come and learn about different parts of the world, learn to speak the languages, learn the cultures, learn the histories, with a goal of making the United States more aware of the world. And in some cases with the goal of having a cadre of people who could work for the government and in other capacities who had that knowledge about the world.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah. So I like I said, I did my master's degree in African studies. As part of that degree, I studied Kiswahili, a language. I took all these classes about Africa and politics and culture and all those kinds of things. So when the African Center for the Study of the United States started, the founders, my colleagues at UP, really wanted to kind of flip that model and say, the rest of the world, European and American universities in particular, have a lot to say about African politics and history and culture. What do we have to say about the United States and other parts of the world? So it's very much what we might call an anti-colonial or a decolonial project,
right? Of
saying that, there's a lot of insight that comes from a place about like South Africa into things like the power of protest, right? You think about what some of my colleagues were around for, and others, of course, are influenced by what they went through with the apartheid regime and the protest and the large social movement and the violent resistance to apartheid, the freeing Nelson Mandela, all of those things that they went through. There's a lot to say, right, from that perspective,
yes,
about what's effective, what's not. What do you do in the face of a discriminatory, authoritarian regime? And I think right now, unfortunately, those lessons are particularly salient here in the United States.
Exactly. Now, and that I find that very, very interesting that the model has been flipped at this given time. It's really important. What sparked you to get involved in African studies? Were you always interested in Africa as a child?
No, well, I was always interested in the world as a child. I grew up Southern Baptist, and
as did I.
Southern Baptists have really strong missions education.
Yes.
So I went through. I was a GA, a Girl in Action. I was an ACT teen, and I always loved that. It was the Wednesday night activity at my church, and it was, there was definitely an agenda there. There was definitely a religious purpose. But every month we were learning about a new culture and a new place and making crafts and trying foods and saying a few words in the language. And I just loved it. I thought that was so fascinating.
So that fascinated you.
Yeah. And then when I got to junior high, I went to the old Franklin Junior High School, which no longer exists. Yes. But we had the Youth in Government program through the YMCA was active there. And so I started doing youth legislature and Model UN. And I continued doing Model UN all the way through college. And when I got to my first year of undergrad, I was the only freshman on the team. And so I got last pick of all our topics for our conferences, and it always had to do with Africa.
Oh, wow.
And I had gone into college thinking that I wanted to major in international affairs, and I thought that I wanted to do something with the Middle East. But the more I was doing research for this project and these projects, and the more I sort of started to become like the team Africa person, I realized this is super interesting, and the answers are not obvious. There aren't as many people working on this. There's a lot of opportunity here. And then when I was a junior, I got the opportunity to study abroad in Kenya and Tanzania. And that really sealed the deal for me.
How long were you there?
I was there for a semester. But interestingly, it was the fall of 1998. And on August 7th, 1998, Al-Qaeda bombed the American embassies in both of the countries. So I was sleeping in, right? I was a college student. But my mother woke me up and said, the embassies in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam have been bombed, and President Clinton is about to make a statement. You need to wake up. And I thought, well, for sure we're not going.
Yeah, but, I mean that would be your first thing as well. I'm not going to be going.
Yeah, but the American ambassador at the time in Kenya convened a meeting of the program directors for all the study abroad programs in Kenya that year, and she said, we really want you to go ahead with this because we want to signal to the terrorists that Americans are not afraid, that we're not going to be bowed by their acts of terror, and that, we want to signal to our partners in East Africa, our friends, our allies, that we're still with them and that we're not going to, bring economic harm by canceling programs. And so my program, amazingly, decided to go forward.
Now, how did your mother feel about that?
My parents, they were nervous already.
Yeah.
I have type 1 diabetes, so that was always a concern. How is I going to get all my supplies over there for 4 months and all those kinds of things. But that was my first foray into learning how to smuggle a lot of syringes in my luggage. A lot of insulin.
Now, Laura, you said that was your first foray. I'm a little concerned. Have there been more forays where you've been smuggling syringes?
I mean, entirely legally, but yes. I've been to Africa about 20-something times.
Oh, wow. And each time you've got to carry those
pumps,
supplies.
But back in the days, I had to take all those supplies with me all the time.
And I'm sure that, that was a challenge for a lot of people who have to travel with medical things all the time.
Oh, yeah. And, it's not as bad as it used to be, but there used to be a sort of, underpaid airport staff, security people have an incentive to go through your luggage and see if there's anything that they can come up with a quote unquote tax for.
Yeah.
or a way to get a bribe off of you. So you learn to pack real strategically.
Did you encounter any of that, or did you always pack well enough?
I've encountered all kinds of adventures, but there's a few tricks. I probably won't go into them here, but
you should write a book about your African travels. Yes. Well, let's talk about specifically the things that interest the University of Pretoria in American politics. What specific topics do you think is studied the most and commented on the most?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of interest globally in American politics because, of course, what happens in the United States affects every other part of the globe.
Right.
So people are curious about, how Americans vote, why they vote the way they do, why you chose this particular leader at this particular time. What is that leader going to do? What are people in Congress going to do? And how will that affect us and our economy and our standing in the world? So there's certainly an interest in, any topic you can imagine. I have a colleague who's interested in it at the University of Pretoria. But I think that, we're seeing right now a lot of parallels in thinking about the dangers of single party rule. So when you have one party that controls everything, what does that open the door to? So for example, in South Africa, since the end of apartheid in 1994, the African National Congress has been the ruling party. So the African National Congress was a social movement that engaged in both nonviolent and violent resistance to the apartheid regime, and ultimately prevailed. Nelson Mandela was the head of the ANC. He was, of course, elected the first president of the country in 1994 when they had their first free and fair elections. Well, understandably, people who lived through apartheid view the ANC as their liberator. It was their liberator. And so they tended to vote for it all the time and overwhelmingly. But this wasn't necessarily a great thing for South Africa over time, because when you have one party rule, that diminishes the accountability to voters, right? If the party says, well, the people are going to support us no matter what we do, and there's no checks and balances, there's no party in parliament strong enough to counteract them, there's no, threat of losing elections at the local or provincial levels. That opens the door to corruption, opens the door to all kinds of bad behavior on the part of the ruling party. And interestingly enough, we've now been through 30 years since the end of apartheid. So you have almost 2 generations of people who were either born after apartheid or were very young children when it ended. And so they don't really remember the worst of the abuses during that time. Those folks do not have the same loyalty to the ANC that their parents and their grandparents have. And so interestingly, in May, when the country had its sort of 30th anniversary elections, the voters did not give the ANC a clear majority. They've had to form a coalition government working with other parties. And for the ANC, that might be seen as disastrous, right? But I think most of my colleagues think that's actually a really healthy sign that the democracy is maturing, that people are not just willing to give the ANC a pass on poor governance because of what it did in the past, but voters are holding the party accountable for things like its failure to maintain strong public services. I was last at the University of Pretoria last spring, and we were on rolling power blackouts across the country. You actually had to download an app that would tell you when you wouldn't have power in your area of the country, in your city and town. And since the elections, that has gotten fixed, right? More accountability meant better public services.
Right. So when the people felt some pain, then they realized a change was coming.
Exactly.
You've said a lot, and I have to tell you, I'm just... At one point, I thought, is she talking about the United States or is she talking about South Africa? Because, it sounded so similar. But then, interestingly, you also mentioned that their democracy is maturing. And so they are beginning to see a change away from this specific one-party rule. And our democracy ought to be mature by now, but so do you think, and you're also a political scientist, so do you think that there is that democracy and its levels come in waves in countries? Because I think we've gone from single party rule, even though it was a democracy, to a healthy mix. And now we're headed right, and we may have done that several times. Now we are so deep in right now to single party rule. And when you were mentioning South Africa, you said they don't have any chance of the other side getting elected in provinces. Well, it's the very same thing right here in Tennessee. Certainly with our supermajority at the state house, and we're not going to have a supermajority in the U.S. Congress, but it's going to be a majority, which is all they need basically. Speak to me on that.
Yeah, that's a great question. So South Africa is in a process of what political scientists call democratic consolidation. It takes a long time for countries to become democracies. One of my favorite questions to ask students when I taught was, when do you think the United States became a democracy?
Well, we really haven't yet, right?
Well, this is the question, right? So some people will say 1781 when the Constitution was written. Others will say, well, not until after the Civil War when we got the Civil War amendments. But was everybody allowed to vote? In the early days of the United States as a republic, only white men who owned property could vote. And in many ways, the story of America has been the story of expanding the franchise to more and more people. So with the 19th Amendment, women, right? With the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, people of color, although it took even longer for like indigenous people, other people of color to get their voting rights as well. Nowadays, we do have what we would consider more or less universal franchise, universal suffrage, where pretty much every adult can vote. But there are still questions, right, about the rights of immigrants, about the rights of people with felony convictions on their records.
And the votes don't weigh the same.
Right. And questions about gerrymandering and apportionment and all those kinds of things. We know that this takes decades, if not centuries, for a country to become a true consolidated democracy. And there is this question of sort of, is there an endpoint? Do you ever get there, right? We don't have any country that has sort of, hit. I mean, I think we have countries that we consider consolidated democracies, most of Western Europe, the United States, that kind of thing. But there's always room for more freedom, right? And more expansion. A country like South Africa, it's going to take a while, right? We have something we call the 2 turnover rule. So when you see 2 peaceful handovers of power from one party to another. So if it were the United States, the first time that power goes from the Democrats to the Republicans and the Republicans back to the Democrats, when that happens 2 times, we say that's a really strong marker that you are a consolidated democracy. The flip side, though, is what we call democratic backsliding. And I am deeply concerned that the United States is in a period of democratic backsliding. That is, where the gains of the past start to revert. Because
it definitely feels that way. Because
of an interest
we experienced a non-peaceful turnover of power.
Well, we an attempted non-peaceful turnover of power, right? And so that's deeply concerning, I think, for scholars of democracy, for anyone who cares about the freedoms and we have really good evidence that democracies produce the best outcomes for quality of life, not just for human rights and human freedom, but for things like material well-being, health, those kinds of things, education. And so periods of democratic backsliding are very dangerous.
So, we had discussed before we started taping that I had a question about the correlation or comparison between some of Africa's fragile democracies and fragile states and what the U.S. is experiencing right now. And I can see clearly now that there is a definite correlation.
It's interesting. So in 2016, when Trump was elected, in the sort of discipline of political science, a lot of our American politics colleagues, we call them Americanists, right? Specialists in American politics. We're like, oh, things will be fine. We have strong institutions. You can't compare America to African countries or other weaker democracies around the world because you're not comparing apples to apples, right? It's not the same thing.
Our foundation
You can only compare
strong.
us to European countries. And we have a strong foundation. And scholars like me who study, so when you study politics in other countries, you're called a comparativist. You compare, different countries. And comparativists said, whoa. I personally said on a panel at the college that I taught at the time that I didn't think our institutions were as strong as we thought they were, because institutions depend on the people who uphold them. Right. And in 2008-9, Mitch McConnell said, basically, we're not going to govern as long as Barack Obama is president. And he held through on that.
True.
When you have the leader of an opposition party refusing to pass legislation basically out of spite, that is not the sign of healthy institutions, right? And unfortunately, the things that have happened in the 8 years since have strongly demonstrated that our institutions and guardrails are nowhere near as strong as we thought they were. And so while I do think we have to be careful, we are comparing a 225-year-old democracy when we compare to African cases to, sort of 70-year-old countries,
right,
most of which have not been democracies for more than 20 years or 30 years. We do have to be careful, but I think there are some important lessons there. I've already mentioned the danger of one-party rule. The other is like the weaponization of the state to go after political enemies. People like me know a lot about that. We know a lot about coup attempts as well.
Right.
I was watching January 6th live. I was on Twitter at the time and remember tweeting like the Secret Service just grabbed Mike Pence and bundled him out of the chamber. What on earth is going on? And as those events unfolded, it looked way too familiar to me.
Oh, I'm sure.
With so many cases that I've seen before. And I think there are a lot of important lessons we can learn.
Do you have, Dan, I'm just thinking about fragile democracies and newer democracies, and I immediately began to think of Hungary and Viktor Orban. Do you have peers who study that particular democracy or attempt at that?
I mean, I wouldn't call Hungary. I don't think anybody would call Hungary a democracy at this point. But
no, but
yeah, and I think one of the things, there's a lot of in the aftermath of an election.
But they were on a path to democracy,
right?
They were,
and they have been derailed by a strong man who has the support of a certain segment of the leadership and has been able to enact increasingly draconian policies with very little pushback.
And he seems to be a role model for some politicians in the U.S.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think one of the things that's gotten lost in a lot of the post-election commentary here is that the move toward Trump is part of a global trend, right? There is a global trend. If we look at all of our sort of peer states in Europe, et cetera, in every election in the past 2 or 3 years, there's been an anti-incumbent bias. And in most cases, that anti-incumbent bias has gone in a rightward direction toward more far-right candidates, toward people. The only exception to this is France. And, in France, and in round one of the election, it did move to the right, and they just formed a coalition to defeat the far right there.
Right. For now, I mean, I guess Le Pen is out of power.
And she's in some legal trouble, so we'll see.
But there's a void and someone will fill it, I think.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. Absolutely.
Interesting. Well, I guess we have to talk about our recent election, don't we? And I read a column this morning by my friend, and probably your friend as well, David French. He writes in the New York Times, and I was interested in something he said, and I thought, I want to discuss that with Laura. Like all of us, we're trying to come up with how did this happen?
Yeah.
And not just how did my favorite candidate lose, but for me and a lot of people I know, it's more than that. It is how did someone who is so against the values and ideals that many of us have, how did that person win? I mean, I think even those who voted for Trump will, have to admit he's a bombastic liar most of the time. He exaggerates everything, and he's sort of the crazy uncle at Thanksgiving, and that you think, oh God, are we inviting him again? Somebody hide the booze, But David French said something that was interesting that I wanted to discuss with you, and he said he came up with some things that he thought were the reasons for why this situation may have happened. And one of the things he said is that we are oddly moving away from decency and tolerance. Would you agree or disagree?
Who's we in that sense?
Well,
I guess would be my first question.
We would be more than 50% of the voters, or at least enough to have elected someone who...
I mean, I do think I find David French absolutely fascinating.
Yes.
He's on a journey. I don't think he has reached his end point on his journey.
I agree. That's an interesting way to put it.
He, realizing that what he genuinely believed in, may have been manipulated by others for the pursuit of power, I guess is the way I would put that. And watching him realize that through his own life experiences, through the experience of having an adopted African-American child, those kinds of things I think are having a profound effect. I do agree that a very large segment of Americans have lost a sense of decency and shame. But I don't think it's everyone. One of the things I'm most interested in here in Williamson County is that while turnout across Tennessee was basically on par with 2020 turnout, here in Williamson County, it was down 5%.
Yeah, isn't that interesting?
5% of our voters didn't show up.
Right, right.
Who did show up last time, even though voting in 2020 was, a little bit more challenging with the pandemic conditions at the time. I suspect, that this will require more research and more data that we just don't have yet. But I'm wondering how many of those people are people who supported Nikki Haley in the Republican primary, right? And just could not bring themselves to vote for Donald Trump, but also couldn't bring themselves to vote for Kamala Harris. I do think that there is a core of people who are deeply concerned about decency there, but who, for whatever reason, because their church tells them that they can't vote for Democrats or because of misperceptions about the economy, that kind of thing, couldn't do it. I'm very interested in who those people are and why they didn't vote.
That is interesting, and I hope that it that there will be some way for some of those people to speak out and say why they didn't.
Yeah,
I think when I think about it, and when I think about what David wrote, what concerns me most is that I do see a movement around the world, certainly in civilized democratic type nations, that the economy means so much more than everything else. So it makes it very difficult for progressives to campaign and not talk about our core values, which seem to be the thing that turned a lot of voters off. That's hard.
It's really hard to come to grips with. I mean, I think, my colleagues who study American politics will tell you that the economy, particularly inflation or perceptions of inflation, is always the top indicator. I mean, it goes back to Clinton, right? It's the economy, stupid.
Right.
It really is the economy, stupid. And whether the macroeconomic indicators are strong, like they are at the moment, doesn't really matter to ordinary people who are paying more for groceries than they were 5 years ago. That said, at the same time, I think we have a lot of voters who are in a really toxic stew of misinformation and disinformation, who believe the things that they are told. I just went on a road trip, and the other day I think I paid $2.30 for gas, $2.30 a gallon for gas in Mississippi. And was like, people are complaining about gas prices, but I remember paying $5 a gallon when Trump was president.
Absolutely.
But people forget. And I think that there is this kind of naivete among a lot of voters that Trump's a good businessman, that he's going to fix this, even though if you look at the actual policies he's proposing, right? So things like
there's going to make things worse.
Deporting millions of people many of whom pick our food out of the fields, many of whom pack and process meat products in plants in Kansas and elsewhere. That's going to make food prices go up. Slapping tariffs on products from abroad. I learned this morning that 75% of apple juice comes from China.
I had no idea.
Yeah, I had no idea either. But a reporter there's a really interesting article in The Atlantic called entitled something like "Get Ready for Food Prices to Go Up."
Those
this is going to
sippy
cause
box things that all the moms are buying for their kids. Now they're not going to like that when the price of those
and I think in a year when we're paying 3%, 10% more for groceries than we are right now, I don't know if people will realize that it's because of what they chose at the ballot box. The Republicans have a very strong messaging machine. They're very good at not taking the blame for things that are their fault, and coming up with some narrative to make it the Democrats' fault.
Well, and I think we know that if prices begin to move up quickly, and I mean, if this mass deportation thing that he says he will do actually happens, we will see a lot of prices move up very, very quickly. But we can already predict the messaging will be, they left us a mess. We're trying to clean it up, But I see long-term damage to our finances as a country if all of these policies come to pass, because people often forget that immigrants who do work, say, in a meat processing plant in Kansas, they may not have the paperwork to make them here legally for long term, but they are paying Social Security taxes because they are W-2 employees.
Right.
And we use those taxes to shore up the budget of the United States. And they're paying Social Security taxes like the rest of us do. And they will never, ever get that money back like we hope to when we get our Social Security. Undocumented
immigrants pay billions of dollars in taxes every year.
Yes.
So they rent apartments, right? They are paying property taxes through their rental prices. They pay into Social Security and Medicare, even though they never receive those benefits back. They pay sales taxes, right? Like the rest of us do on everything that they buy. There's all kinds of benefits. And there's an economist at George Mason University, my friend Michael Clemens. And I will note that George Mason University's economics department is known for being very conservative and libertarian. Michael has done a ton of research on what the impacts of mass deportations would be. And he and others are expecting massive negative effects, including that there will not be as many jobs for American citizens. Right. So if you deport 11 million people, that's 11 million people who aren't paying rent, who aren't buying things.
True.
And that has effects on businesses, right? That causes restaurants to shut down, small businesses to shut down, other services. And so it will actually have a negative effect on American citizen jobs.
And, that is something that I had a discussion with someone about the other day because I spend some time in Marshall County, which is a rural county south of where we are now. And many of the listeners know or live in rural counties all over Tennessee. And, there's always a going joke. How many Mexican restaurants does a rural town have? Well, we always have a lot. And people go to all of them, and they're usually very good. And in Marshall County, the joke is, well, we've got to have our margaritas from somewhere. But I was talking with someone having lunch in Marshall County the other day, and I said, when this happens and these restaurants close down, it's not just the Mexican employees who are gone. It's so much more than that. Cisco trucks pull into the county every day delivering food to these restaurants. Cisco employs a lot of people. And it's just a long arm of things that it will affect. And it's not just as simple as, oh, well, they were here illegally, now they're gone. And I also wonder if big business will eventually have to step in and say, you can't do this. This is not going to work for us because, we have meat to process. Who's going to do that?
Right. I mean, I think the construction industry is another interesting question, right?
Perfect
Something like
example.
30 to 40% of construction workers are immigrants. I don't know exactly what percentage of those are undocumented, but it's a very high percentage. We already have a housing shortage in this country. That's one of the major pocketbook issues that drove voters right during this election. Deporting those folks will not fix the housing shortage issue.
No, and it certainly won't make the prices less.
And it will not make housing in any way more affordable. The market in a place like Williamson County, which is absolutely out of control in terms of affordability, such that teachers, firefighters, police officers, folks can't even remotely dream of living here anymore. Those kinds of things are going to get a lot worse. I was living in Georgia in 2011 when Georgia passed a pretty harsh anti-immigration bill. And the effect of that was that it basically allowed law enforcement to stop anybody who quote unquote looked foreign, right? And pull them over and potentially deport them or hand them over for deportation proceedings. And so what happened was all the migrants left. And it happened to be summertime when this all went down. And it was time to pick the peach crop. It was time to pick the watermelon crop. It was time to pick the peanut crop, other crops that, Georgia's agriculture sector is heavily dependent on.
Right.
And there was nobody to do it. And they went to the governor at the time, and the governor said, well, I know what we'll do. We'll get former felons to do it, right? So people who have to check the box that says, yes, I have a felony conviction and therefore have trouble getting employment. He was like, we will put them to work in the fields. This will solve two problems at once, give these folks jobs and meet the labor shortage. So they bus all these people out to these farms. Most of them did not last a day because that is backbreaking, difficult work in miserable heat and humidity.
Hot in Georgia, yes.
And so then the news was like, well, how bad could it be, right? So the news station that I watched in Atlanta sent one of their big burly guys, like looked like a former football player, really strong, tall guy. He was so exhausted by the time it was time for the 6 o'clock news that he could not stand up. He was like having to sit down in the field, kind of reclined back next to the watermelons, and said, there's no way I could do this for more than what I did today.
Right.
And, Georgia had to kind of scale back on that because it was disastrous and crops were rotting in the fields. Farmers lost their income for that year and had to rely on their farmers insurance. There's going to be so many far-reaching consequences. And, when you're having to pay $8 for a carton of strawberries next year or the year after, will people make the connection that that's because of how they voted? I don't know.
Well, I don't see how they can avoid making that connection. I just, obviously the media will play a role, but I am afraid, I am very afraid that it will get that bad, and it will harm a lot of people and a lot of people's budgets, and that makes me very sad. So these are the things that sort of, keep your host up at night, is thinking about how bad will it get. And then, of course, I worry about my friends who are in communities that will be harmed by a lot of these policies.
Absolutely.
And so when we talk about these social issues, such as respecting the LGBTQIA plus community, we know, and I'll ask you about this in just a minute, but we know that those things just didn't resonate with a lot of voters. Frankly, Laura, they just don't care.
No.
If it's not their issue or their child's issue, they don't care. And some of them have said, even if it's my child's issue, I don't care. She's a crazy 20-something-year-old, And so as a dedicated progressive and Democrat, that is the sort of thing that I really wrestle with, is how do we campaign? How do candidates speak? And if they really want to get elected, what we're seeing in Tennessee is you can't mention those issues. I think the only issue we can mention that might have some crossover is gun legislation. And even that didn't land as strongly as we hoped.
No.
And one would think with the Covenant School being just up the road or very near the Tennessee State House, that would have resonated with voters. But even that wasn't enough to really honestly change the math from what it's been for the last decade.
Yeah, again, I think pocketbook issues trump everything, but I was genuinely surprised
intended.
In the the District 61 race where Claire Jones ran against Gino Bolso.
Yes.
I thought I wasn't sure she could win. I mean, I was hopeful she could win, but I wasn't sure. But I did think she would be able to move the needle, and that we would see, Covenant parents and their friends turn out to vote against this one guy who repeatedly lied to Covenant parents behind closed doors about what he was going to do, and then voted in the opposite direction, who repeatedly showed disrespect to those families. I really thought that we might see the needle move.
And I did too. Claire was a guest here on the podcast, so you listeners can go back and listen to that. And we spoke a lot about the gun legislation issues. We also talked about her dedication to health care. We talked about expanding Medicaid. I thought that issue would land with a lot of voters as well, so that we would see the needle move. But it did not. And so you've studied the results. Do you believe a lot of that was because people just voted a straight ticket?
I think it is. I think the power of evangelicalism as a political movement, which I think evangelicalism is becoming more political and less religious every day.
Which should not even be a thing.
Well,
one should not even say those two things in the same sentence, but that's where we are, isn't it?
But it is, right?
Yes.
Yeah, and I think it's very difficult to overcome that, and I think we saw that this year. I think. I've seen a lot of hand-wringing among Democrats about, should we use terms like Latinx, or should we talk about the trans community and protecting the trans community? And some were, people a little more on the conservative side of the Democratic Party saying, well, that's why Kamala lost. Harris didn't talk about any of those things, right?
No, she did not.
Never,
David
ever
French mentions that in his article. She did not.
What term we should use to talk about Hispanic voters or trans issues. And I think it would be a huge mistake to throw those folks under the bus.
Totally.
I believe that everybody's liberation is tied together, and that if we let transgender people be treated poorly, it's just a matter of time before they come for gay and lesbian folks. And then it's just a matter of time before they come for birth control, come for abortion, right? Issue after issue will fall if we don't stand in solidarity with the most vulnerable people in our communities.
What you're saying is resonating so much with me because I believe that the Republican propaganda machine, and I do believe that their messaging, as you said, is on point. Hey, credit where credit is due. And I think that they have taken an issue like transgender, and our thinking on that is, hey, everyone should be respected. It's not my business, for one thing, and secondly, human beings should be respected. And then if you want to argue about all of the points about the transgender movement, if you want to say there is such a thing, or the medical issues around that, you can talk about all that. But the bottom line is, as Democrats, we believe people should be respected and their rights should be protected in the United States. And that should be our message, but then it gets turned into, they're coming for your children, they're groomers. Oh my God.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's too soon to have data for this election, but we have evidence from the past. So Andy Beshear in Kentucky, the governor,
yes,
they went after him on transgender issues when he was up for election 2 years ago, and it didn't really move the needle. And there's a lot of evidence across the country showing that these anti-transgender ads and, attacks and all these kinds of things actually don't really change electoral outcomes that much. I would suspect that it's the same this year. Now, this year, the Republicans went all out. Something like 30% of all Republican advertising nationwide was anti-trans. They have clearly picked a group to scapegoat.
So how will we know if that was effective or not?
Well, we ask people, right? Okay. And we look at who voted and ask them how they voted and what year. But I think that, the idea that there's like this group of people who weren't transphobic before, but saw an ad and became transphobic and decided to vote for Donald Trump, I think that's a real leap, right? I think it's more about riling up the base, getting people who are already angry and fearful, and and the truth is, it just doesn't seem to be worth. Like, there's no trade-off there. Nobody's going to vote for Democrats just because we stop talking about transgender kids.
Correct.
And so let's focus on what actually matters rather than getting distracted by what the GOP wants us to focus on and wants to use, right? Because the GOP is very good at using these sort of culture war issues that they create to distract from their failures in other areas, to distract from the fact, right? It's not a coincidence that we've seen this congresswoman this week throwing a hissy fit about who's going to be allowed to use the bathrooms in the Capitol at the same time that we have multiple sexual predators being nominated as cabinet officials in the Trump administration. This is designed to draw attention away from these very serious and very real issues about Matt Gaetz, about Pete Hegseth, and others who are manifestly unqualified for the jobs that Trump wants to put them into,
so as
in addition
Democrats,
to being apparently generally horrible people.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so as Democrats, it almost feels like we have to just let it happen so we can say, I told you so.
I mean, it's really hard. I think one of the things I've been really interested in, there was a 13% shift to the right in Hispanic majority counties across the United States.
Yes, I saw that. And that's shocking to me.
I think the idea that the Latino community is a monolith is one that's very common among people who are not in those areas. And, but of course, there's a lot of diversity of thought and a lot of diversity of identities within those communities. But the fact that we saw this shift, not everybody has undocumented relatives. Not everybody is in the country illegally, right? It's a very, very complicated story. But I think that there are a lot of people who are extremely naive and who think, I was reading an article this morning about how it was in the New York Times about how Democrats lost Hispanic voters and some other voters of color. And they were talking to a woman who was an immigrant. And he's like, well, he's not going to come for the good ones, the people who work hard and pay taxes. And, you think of yourself and your family as, quote unquote, the good immigrants.
We think not.
As opposed to others.
Right. Right.
And it's not at all clear to me. I mean, if you're talking about deporting, he has used up to 15 million people. There are not 15 million undocumented people in the United States. Best estimates are around 11 million. Rounding those folks up, putting them into detention camps. The state of Texas has officially offered the Trump administration a plot of land in Starr County on the border.
I saw that. And it's
detention camps.
Several hundred acres that they've offered.
It's like 1,400 acres.
Yes.
That's going to be real ugly. And there's a lot of people who are going to find out that they were wrong about Trump. Somebody in that article was saying, oh, he's not a racist. He likes people like me. And I'm like, sir, no. I don't know how to tell you that. But there's other data. There was an Ipsos poll taken in October, I believe it's October, that showed that people who were intending to vote for Trump were far more likely to believe things that were false on a number of social issues. So the idea that crime is rising, which is not true. Trump voters believe it is. The idea that there is a crisis at the border, not true. Trump voters believe that it is,
so
right?
Why
all
is
of these
that?
things, because they're in this stew of misinformation. And I think especially, one of the stories out of this is that young men broke for Trump. If you think about what do young men do for fun these days, right? They're online, they're listening to podcasts, they're gambling.
Around here, they're out shooting their guns.
There are, but all of those spaces
yes.
Are kind of in a toxic stew of right-wing propaganda. People like Joe Rogan telling you how to be a man.
Right.
People like Andrew Tate telling you how to be a man with just the most misogynistic and vile behavior, right? And
yes.
vile language. But if that's all you hear, you start to believe it's true and you discount information that suggests it's not, right? We all have this kind of bias toward believing what we already believe. And I think that, that is a really vexing problem. I don't know how you overcome that. But it's here that I will pull us back to South Africa, right? The same thing was true under apartheid. The apartheid regime controlled information. There was one television channel. There was one set of approved newspapers, one set of approved radio stations.
And just briefly, tell us. So, yes, and I'm old enough to remember some of that, but a lot of the listeners won't be.
Yeah.
So just briefly explain what apartheid was and then how the movement started to overthrow that.
Yeah, so apartheid was a legally sanctioned regime of white supremacy in South Africa, introduced in the early 20th century, and then later in the 40s, I believe, a party called the National Party, the NP, won control and instituted legal segregation. So they passed all these laws that severely restricted what people could do and how they could live their lives, where they could live, what kinds of jobs they could have, every aspect of life on the basis of race.
What percentage of South Africans are... Is black the right term?
So, off the top of my head, I can't tell you that, but a large black majority, like 80%-ish, maybe not quite 80, but, and then you had a small white minority. And then you also had a group of people who were of mixed race ancestry, some of whom were Indian, so of Indian origin, others who are of mixed race, right? So, and broadly, there were 3, 4, depending on how you count it, categories under apartheid. So white people had the most privileges. Indians, who they called Asians, and they called them colored, COLOURED. So mixed race people had the kind of intermediate level, and then black people had the fewest privileges.
And so the ruling class was the tiniest majority of people.
The tiny minority, right? The tiny white minority. And it was Jim Crow segregation on steroids.
Yes.
Is probably the easiest way to understand it. It was an authoritarian state. There was no free speech. Black people did not have the right to vote. You had to live in certain areas. They controlled movement. So you basically had to have an internal passport, something called a pass book, to be able to move around. And Black people were generally only able to work like as domestic staff in someone's home, so a housekeeper, a nanny. And most Black men were shuffled into labor, particularly in South Africa's mining industry, which is very
important. And we're not
important.
talking about this happening in the 1920s.
No. Well, yes, but no.
Yes, but I mean, this was happening.
No, this is in living memory.
Yes,
This did not end until 1994.
Right.
So any kind of criticism of the regime was met with brutal crackdowns. The African National Congress formed very early on as a resistance movement to this. They were heavily influenced by Mahatma Gandhi's nonviolence principles. Nelson Mandela, who was a young lawyer in the country at the time, got involved in this. But over a period of time, they realized that holding protests and other forms of nonviolent resistance was not working. And there were splits in the movement, like there are in all social movements, but they essentially decided to form something called the Mkhonto wa Sizwe. I apologize to my our Kosha listening speakers because I cannot pronounce it correctly, but the MK for short, which was the armed wing of the ANC, essentially undertook a kind of guerrilla movement style of resistance, which the white nationalist regime in South Africa called terrorism. I think you would objectively describe it as terrorism. It was the use of violence for a political goal.
Right.
But in this case, the political goal was most of us would say that it was a just political goal. Of
course.
And this was a long, long struggle. Nelson Mandela was caught in a bombing plot, along with several others. And he was imprisoned in the late 1960s. Was not released until the early 1990s in the lead up to freedom in 1994.
And it's interesting, in my age group, no one had to explain to me why it was so important that Nelson Mandela was being released from prison. But a lot of our listeners have very little memory of this. And that's why I asked you
absolutely.
to go through that. And, of course, no one of sound mind wants it to come to that in the United States. We want to think that if we send enough emails to our representatives, if we make enough phone calls, if we protest enough, if we show up at the State House enough, things will begin to change. And I'm holding to that truth, also knowing that if things get painful enough, combined with our protest, whether that comes in whatever way it comes in, if you're a letter writer, a phone call, or put a bumper sticker on your car, whatever. But all of that combined can bring us back to some sense of normalcy.
I hope so. I hope so. I will tell you I'm less optimistic. I'm hopeful, but I'm not optimistic.
I am too. And I'm trying to wrap my head around, how am I going to do if I'm arrested? Because,
Yeah, I think a lot of, especially white Americans, it's so unfathomable that a lot of us are not able to think or process that this might actually not be a democracy in a few years.
Right.
That we are engaged in a process of democratic backsliding. But I'll tell you, I took a vacation after the election because I really needed a break. But I don't know how to relax. So I went and visited some of the civil rights sites in Mississippi on my way home from my vacation, and went to the Medgar Evers and Murray Evers home in Jackson.
Yes.
As well as to the new Emmett Till and Mamie Till National Memorial in Sumner, Mississippi. And those places are both really powerful reminders of the civil rights movement and really powerful reminders that, in fact, there are a lot of Americans still alive today. Murray Evers is still with us.
Correct.
Who have lived through authoritarian rule.
Yes.
The Jim Crow was an authoritarian system. It was a deeply corrupt system of white minority rule by a small number of white people, right? By an elite who really didn't care who they ran roughshod over in their quest to have absolute power and to exploit the labor of others. And these folks had extraordinary courage.
They did.
And I think the reminder that some of us have been here before, the lessons that we take, whether it's from the resistance to the apartheid regime, whether it's from the resistance to Jim Crow, that it requires courage, that it requires sometimes putting yourself in danger and your family in danger. are going to be really important things for us to remember and lessons for us to look to as we move into this kind of uncertain future.
It does feel extremely uncertain. And I'm sure that your peers in political studies all over the world are just watching what happens next. And we've, I think, and we're going to wrap up here in just a minute, but I think we've got a big test coming up very, very soon because the appointments that President-elect Trump is making will either go through hearings or not. And if we see that recess appointments are made, and for the listeners who don't know, basically, and this is a very elementary explanation of it, but basically the Senate and the House of Representatives can show up for work in January with all their new members, and then they can say, oh, go home for a week. And during that week, President Trump can just put his people in place because there are some rules that allow him to do that. And I believe most of them can stay for like 210 days. Those are called recess appointments, and it's sort of the nuclear option, which could happen. And I'm not going to say that Democrats have not used that in the past. That has been used. I don't think it's a good idea ever, because what we're saying is we elected you senators, but now don't do your job. But I do believe that we are very soon going to see which way this thing is going to go. And that's pretty frightening for me and a lot of people I know. And also I do think that good and decent people are going to have to personally draw their own line in the sand. How much are they willing to stand by and watch people they care about harmed before they step in? And in my case, it would be using my privilege, as a white woman. Well, wow, we've talked about a lot of things, and I want to have you back once the data has been more fully analyzed and we can talk about some local races and what happened or didn't happen, and then we can look at the state. And, of course, we have a very interesting year coming up. We have another continuation of the supermajority, which did not change at all in the last election here in Tennessee, and they feel they've been given the green light to do all the things that they want to do, which involve a lot of things like school vouchers is really the least of those things, actually. And they're already starting to have discussions about who can and can't use what restroom because, gosh, that's the most important thing we have to worry about, isn't it? It's ridiculous,
I don't pay attention to what other people are doing in the restroom.
No, and I've
seems
never,
like a weird thing to be obsessed with.
Exactly, and I've never looked at someone coming in the restroom trying to determine, are you a biological woman or not?
It's just, it's a little creepy.
Yeah, I go in the stall, I shut the door, I do what I got to do.
The people who are obsessed with other people's children's private parts, like it's creepy.
It is a little bit, yeah, it's quite bizarre. Well, thank you so much for coming on Blue Lift. As I said, I want to have you back so we can discuss all these other things. But the compare and contrast between South Africa and the African nations and their fledgling democracies and what we're going through right now is fascinating. And I can imagine that your entire field of study is just broadening every day by what those crazy Americans are doing.
We are never bored. I can say that for sure. But thanks so much for having me, and I'd love to come back. It's a lot of fun.
Yes, thank you so much. So listeners, there's going to be some interesting show notes that my producer is going to put down for you. And Laura, if someone wanted to follow you on the socials, how would one do so?
So I am on Blue Sky, which is finally taking off. I've been on there for a little over a year, and it's a lot of fun. But I am there as Texas in Africa.
Okay.
.bsky.com or whatever it is.
Okay.
Social, maybe.
All right. And do you have any articles out right now or any?
I don't have anything out at the moment. A lot of what I do at UP is helping my colleagues to get their voices out globally.
Right.
So,
okay.
Yeah, I try to kind of take a back seat to my African colleagues because I think their voices are the most important in this. But if I did, I'd be happy to share it.
Yeah, great. All right. Well, thank you. And listeners, I would love for you to share this podcast with your friends and let them know that we talk about all sorts of topics here at Blue Lift. And if you want to give a review, that's great. And if you need to reach out to me when you pull this podcast up, you'll see a way that you can do that. And if you have any questions for myself or Dr. C, we're happy to get you answers to those. Hope everyone has a great day.